welcome to Trendlines, a podcast on global affairs brought to you by World Politics Review. I'm Elliot Waldman. Just a quick note before we get started that if you like what you hear on Trendlines, you can stay up to date with new episodes by hitting the subscribe button wherever you get your podcasts if you haven't done so already. You can also find a full archive of previous episodes at worldpoliticsreview.com/podcast. North Korea's ruling Workers' Party of Korea has had a busy start to the year. Earlier this month, the 8th Party Congress was held in Pyongyang, 8 days of meetings featuring a 9-hour work report read out by leader Kim Jong Un himself. Just a couple days after those meetings wrapped up, Kim oversaw a celebratory military parade, the second one since October, featuring a submarine-launched ballistic missile that state media described as, quote, the world's most powerful weapon. New analysis of satellite imagery by the James Martin Center for Nonproliferation Studies at the Middlebury Institute suggests there could be a new test of a submarine-launched missile fairly soon, although, as always with North Korea, it's a guessing game where weapons tests are concerned. All of this comes amid a terrible economic situation in North Korea, which has been ravaged by border closures and other measures taken in response to the coronavirus pandemic, still recovering from a few really bad typhoons that hit the country last year. We also have a transition of power in Washington, tensions between the United States and China, and a president in South Korea approaching the end of his term, but who would still like to try to find some way to reboot engagement with North Korea. My guest today has been keeping a close eye on all of these developments from Seoul, where she's based. Duyeon Kim is an adjunct senior fellow with the Asia-Pacific Security Program at the Center for a New American Security. She writes frequently on the two Koreas and East Asian geopolitics, as well as on nuclear nonproliferation and arms control issues. She writes a regular column for the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, which I highly recommend all of our listeners check out. I'm really looking forward to digging into all of the latest news on North Korea with her. So Duyeon, welcome to Trendlines.
Thanks so much, Elliot, for having me.
As I mentioned in the intro, the 8th Party Congress of the Workers' Party of Korea was held earlier this month. These big confabs are pretty rare in North Korea, as the number suggests. It's only been the 8th one. So they're obviously closely watched by analysts like yourself. Let me start by asking what your big picture takeaways were from this most recent event.
Well, first, I'd like to start out with an important piece of context to understand these party congresses, because I think it's important. And I know the takeaways are important too, but this context is also. To me, it was another reminder that we should not overestimate or underestimate what the Kim leader says in these meetings. So while we should not overinterpret everything Kim Jong Un says and take it as the holy Bible, because there is some fluff in what he says. Still, his explicit articulation of certain issues that we'll get into, they still serve as useful data points for people like me that confirm our expectations and suspicions and help us further understand Pyongyang. And so not everything is framed in the context of America. His main audience for these party congresses is the North Korean people, his North Korean elite, the officials that are helping to run the show. And so I think that's one. And so I know it does not sound black and white, and I'll try to show you what I mean throughout our conversation. I do want to begin by pointing out that the main purpose, again, of these party congresses is to make decisions on party direction and policies and to reorganize or reshuffle the party's leadership. And I know that's less of an interest in the broad scheme of things when it comes to foreign policy, but that still is an important point. So their main audience is North Koreans, but that said, there are clues as to Kim's thinking on his direction with the U.S. and South Korea, as well as clues as to what types of weapons he wants to eventually make. And so for this one, like previous party congresses and his report, they call them reports, but it's basically his remarks or his statement. They have three general audiences. One is, again, the North Korean people. The other is the United States. And the third is South Korea. And in terms of, there are three messages. So, the audience is, of course, North Koreans are the biggest, but there's still a message for the U.S. and South Korea to tune into.
So in this particular instance, what was the message to the North Korean domestic audience?
the main message was all about the economy. And that's nothing new. We've heard about this before. We were expecting him to roll out with a 5-year plan, economic development plan. And it's this party Congress, his message was even more important to the North Korean people because, as you mentioned in your intro, North Korea has been going through very difficult economic times. They've been hit with, what we call a triple whammy, basically. Before it's been, international economic sanctions. Then came like the summer typhoon, disaster from natural disasters like typhoons, and then the coronavirus pandemic. And I would argue that now, they always complain about the sanctions, but I would argue that now the coronavirus pandemic is perhaps the biggest so-called sanction. It's not a real sanction, but because North Korea has forced itself into self-isolation by essentially, shutting down its border with China, by cutting off nearly all trade with China, its biggest benefactor and lifeline for its economy and to stay afloat because of the virus, because they're so afraid of contracting the virus. And of course, they officially say they have no COVID cases. And of course, that's very hard to believe, but that just shows how the virus is the biggest threat to North Korea's survival, more so than American nuclear weapons or America's so-called hostile policy that North Korea always complains about. And so this party Congress really, zeroed in on going back to, what is North Korea's fundamental principle of what's called 주체, of self-reliance. So everything has to be, the North Koreans and North Korea have to thrive and prosper because without relying on external help, it always has to come by North Koreans from North Koreans. And so that was his main message, that they need to overcome their economic hardships.
Listening to you speak about that, it makes me wonder because they just had a big military parade last fall for the 75th anniversary of the ruling party's founding, and now this party Congress, and then another military parade on the heels of it. I wonder if there's a significance to doing so many big, flashy gatherings and parades in short succession at a time when the country is struggling so much economically.
And that's a really good point in question. So I do see a correlation there. Typically, we have seen that North Korea likes to show strength when it feels weak. And so clearly they're going through one of its weakest moments economically. And Kim Jong Un has already, towards the end of last year, admitted that his economic policies have failed. And this Party Congress report also essentially basically recognizes and acknowledges that their economic policy has failed. So in that sense, I read and I interpret these military parades and showing off, trying to show up. I mean, they're probably mock-ups, right? But boasting about all this hardware, all this high-tech weaponry, him in his report basically laying out an extravagant wish list of what types of high-tech weapons and nuclear weapons he wants to make. I think that just shows that he feels weak, and he needs to, again, we're talking about the audiences, right? One, tell the North Korean audience, yes, we're going through economic hardships, so don't worry, we are still strong and mighty. The U.S. cannot touch us because we have all this armor and military hardware. So you don't have anything to worry about on that front. I've got that covered. You just focus on helping bring back this economy. And so I read it in that sense. But the other audience is, of course, everybody else is watching and watching the parade and listening to his report. So the other audience is the United States, of course. And so I think here, one of the messages he's trying to send to the United States is, if you don't give me what I want in terms of how we improve our relationship, that I'm really going to go down this path of developing all these fancy weapons. I mean, just very briefly, I'll list the names, the types of weapons he wants to make. There are things like, missiles that have multiple reentry vehicles, things like solid propellant, ICBMs, tactical nuclear weapons, all these fancy words, military reconnaissance satellites, and unmanned aerial systems. So
hypersonic glide vehicles, I think you mentioned, right?
Exactly, hypersonic, yeah. And so there's a lot that they don't even have yet. But see, this is where some of the fluff comes, right? He boasts about them and a lot of the capability he does not have, but at the same time, I think there's still useful signals and indicators that that's where he eventually wants to go. He eventually wants to achieve these types of weapons. And to me, in terms of the military side, I know, in the United States, and most of us are all focused on the long range, the ICBMs that can hit the U.S. Mainland. But they've also got other weapons, the short range missiles, that are also just as destructive and just as concerning. And these short range missiles, he boasted about wanting to develop what are called tactical nuclear weapons. And these are shorter range. They're used for conflict. They're used in the battlefield, and the battlefield would be the Korean Peninsula. And so basically, these are missiles that can target and attack South Korea and Americans living in South Korea. And so for me, that was something that stood out in terms of his wish list. So it's both, a threat to South Korea, but it's also saying, we are going to refine all these weapons that we can use in wartime. And he's also talking about weapons that he would like to use in retaliation. So if the United States, for example, hypothetically, which, it's very difficult to imagine, but if the United States initiated a conflict, North Korea is basically saying, we've got all these weapons that can retaliate against that.
And that highlights, I think, one of the shortcomings of the Trump administration's approach, which was to focus on this moratorium that Kim agreed to on testing long-range intercontinental missiles and not doing any nuclear tests. But in the meantime, he was testing all these shorter-range and submarine-launched missiles, refining his weaponry there. And the Trump administration didn't really seem to care as much about it.
Exactly. And that's where not only was he testing to perfect these types of weapons he can use in battle, but he was also continuing to produce what's called fissile material, the key ingredients that are used in nuclear weapons or for a nuclear warhead that can then be put on to a missile and carried by a missile that becomes basically a nuclear weapon. And so, that was the biggest mistakes that I have always argued, that Trump's red line should not have only been the long range missiles and nuclear device testing, but should have been all classes of missiles. Also because, not just because they're threatening to South Korea and Japan, America's allies, but also because developing any type of missile violates all the UN Security Council resolutions that ban North Korea from testing these missiles, testing nuclear devices, producing anything that goes into a nuclear weapon.
I want to talk more about the nuclear portfolio, but to go back to the domestic message that you were talking about, one of the things that's been interesting for me to observe throughout these recent public appearances by Kim has been to see him so emotional and so contrite, so really just almost maudlin in the amount of raw emotion that he's displaying, like tearing up at that military parade, apologizing for not being able to deliver these economic gains. What do you make of that? Is that a direct response to the current circumstances of the country, or is this him trying to kind of carve out his own leadership style distinct from his father and his grandfather?
I think he's been trying to carve out a leadership style that's very different from his father. And his father was, the image of his father was tyranny, a tyrant and all that. But his grandfather supposedly has this image of like being benevolent, being loved by everybody in North Korea. And so I think that's what he's aiming for, to try to model and emulate his grandfather, maybe to even do a better job. I know it might seem odd seeing, a leader, the North Korean leader who, we all think he doesn't want to show his weakness. And so if he's crying, he might be showing his weakness. No, I know it sounds counterintuitive, but my reading of that display or that show was that for him to show that type of, I don't know if it's called modesty or humility or whatnot, but to cry, to apologize, that I think was in his attempt to actually elicit not only sympathy, but more loyalty and a sense of responsibility. So if your big boss is feeling sorry and is crying, then everybody under him has to feel even more sorry and feel more responsible because it's their fault. They would feel the biggest guilt trip because they caused their leader to cry and to feel bad to them. And so I think, I read it as his way of trying to elicit harder work, more hard work, and perhaps even to guilt trip everybody. But then maybe even perhaps, we don't know how he thinks, or we don't know him. We haven't talked to him directly, but, perhaps it's another way for him to show his more human side as well. And just because he shows a human side doesn't mean that he's showing weakness necessarily in their way of thinking.
Going back to the other of the three audiences that you mentioned on the U.S., I mentioned in my intro, of course, the change of administration here. The new Biden administration came into office just over a week ago. What expectations do you think Kim has on that front? And also, what expectations does Biden have of how to tackle the North Korea issue? It
seems as if Kim Jong Un is taking more of a wait-and-see approach. His Workers' Party report, of course, he tried to, I guess, be more nonchalant about it and be like, he said basically, we don't care who's in the White House. We're still going to go about our way. We're still going to have our own policies, and, we're still all about our main demand is America needs to drop its hostile policy towards us, which basically has been defined as stopping U.S.-South Korea military drills that are defensive, lifting sanctions, and, ending any type of human rights violation criticisms or even name calling. And so that has been, even before President Biden was elected, that has been North Korea's demand towards the end of the Trump administration, or actually after the failure of the Hanoi summit. And they're sticking to it. But at the same time, he talks a bit tough in that report, but at the same time, he technically leaves dialogue open with a high bar, with a very high price tag for talks, big preconditions for talks, which is, again, to America has to first eliminate its hostile policy against it before North Korea is willing to even come out and talk. And so the other, condition that or message was, to South Korea, because South Korea's president, their progressive president, Moon Jae-in, he perhaps at this point in time has the biggest stake in this because his presidential term ends in May of next year. South Korea is granted constitutionally only one 5-year term. And so President Moon has always wanted to establish peace on the Korean Peninsula before he leaves office. So he's pressed for time. And so we've seen him during the Trump administration, try to facilitate symmetry between the U.S. and North Korea. And he's going to go for that again with President Biden and Kim Jong Un. But President Biden during the campaign, he's also made it clear that it's not going to be easy with him. It's not going to be the same deal as it was with Trump, that Kim Jong Un needs to show that he is serious and agree that he is serious about drawing down his nuclear weapons capability before there's any type of FaceTime with a sitting president. And so, and at the same time, as I mentioned, Kim Jong Un has presented or, put the bar very high as well for talks. And so this really puts the South Korean president in a bind because he thinks symmetry is the best way to go because North Korea is a top-down type of country. Whereas President Biden says that he will want to go back to a more traditional approach to foreign policy, which is bottom up.
It's also really difficult for Moon, given the message that came out of the Eighth Party Congress, which, as you mentioned, was we're going to build up our weapons system, we're going to acquire all these advanced systems, we're going to be a nuclear state, and we're going to be respected and we're going to be respected and recognized as a nuclear state. So that just kind of throws a whole big wrench in the denuclearization issue, which has to be the first one to make any progress before this inter-Korean engagement and economic engagement and sanctions relief can take over.
Yeah. And so, along with that, or related to that, is in the English version of Kim Jong Un's report, they left out a huge chunk on inter-Korean relations. In the Korean version, the original Korean version, there's a bit sizable chunk in there. And the message to South Korea basically is, they've been bullying and coercing South Korea for months. That's been going on since the failure of the Hanoi summit. And Kim Jong Un has been upset at South Korean President Moon Jae-in for basically leading Kim to believe that Trump would accept Kim's offer and demand of trading his Yongbyon nuclear complex for the lifting of key UN Security Council sanctions. And of course, we saw Trump rejected that.
Yongbyon being the main nuclear facility, but kind of the oldest one and not the only one. So clearly insufficient, right?
Yes, insufficient because they clearly have uranium enrichment facilities outside of that old complex. And that's important to know because it's much easier. Well, you can hide uranium production. Yongbyon was first built to produce plutonium, which is another ingredient en route to nuclear weapons. But uranium, which is the other route and ingredient to nuclear weapons, you can hide those facilities underground, whereas plutonium, they're out in the open. Satellites can detect them. And we've always been worried about nuclear weapons made from enriched uranium. And so in that sense, it was not a proportionate bargain. And North Korea is basically willing to give the United States something that they believe they didn't need anyway, because they have all these other facilities outside that nuclear complex, producing their nuclear materials for their nuclear weapons. And so that's, in a nutshell, why the United States did not accept that offer. But apparently the South Korean president led North Korea to believe that Trump would be willing to or could accept that deal and everything will be great. But nothing was. And so, and we've seen enough signs, both anecdotally, but also in their official North Korea's official statements, that they're very upset with South Korea ever since then.
They even went so far as to blow up the liaison center that they had set up just across the border in Kaesong last year. That was,
exactly.
Talk about a display of unhappiness.
Exactly. And so in this Party Congress report, North Korea continued that line of, basically treating South Korea like its slave, wanting to treat South Korea like its minion, basically. And it essentially threatens South Korea that, I know you want South Korea under the progressive Moon government. I know you guys are desperate to have these inter-Korean projects, but no, you need to fulfill our demands, which again links back to its demands to the United States. Is South Korea, show your Koreanness, abandon these military exercises with the United States, stop being what North Korea always calls South Korea the puppet, America's puppet. So, stop kowtowing to the imperial Americans. That's basically what they've been saying for years. But they've increased the volume on that over the past most recent couple of years and few months. And so whenever South Korea, even after this Party Congress report, South Korea, that Moon Jae-in and other senior officials kept talking about, we want to resume inter-Korean projects like, tourism, like COVID cooperation. North Korea basically, his sister, Kim Jong Un's sister, Kim Yo-jong, including her, they basically shot that down, saying, you guys really don't get what we're trying to say here. We don't care about these small these pennies into Korean humanitarian projects. We want the big stuff, and the big stuff is, a better relationship with the United States, which means end all this so-called hostility.
Right, an end to the sanctions, basically, that have been choking the economy.
And exactly, and to the sanctions, because again, they always go around full circle back to sanctions. Even though I argued earlier that I think COVID is like the ultimate so-called sanction because they've isolated themselves, so there's really no trade. But international sanctions, even though they've become loose ever since the Winter Olympics in 2018, and then all that summitry that followed after that into Korean summits and then U.S. North Korea summits, still there have been signs that these UN sanctions have had an effect. Not their full effect, because ever since summitry began, we've seen Russia and China not enforce their obligations under UN Security Council resolutions. And so North Korea is going to continue to demand or want movement, real tangible movement, or the lifting of sanctions before it even contemplates and considers coming back to talks.
The whole coronavirus thing does seem to pose a conundrum for people in the U.S. who are advocating more pressure on North Korea, more sanctions, tightening of existing sanctions, because how do you really do that when, as you say, the country is already almost sanctioning itself because it's closing its borders, it's not really accepting tourists in, trade is curtailed in a lot of cases. There's really not much more damage that can be done, it seems.
Well, I think the big difference here is there is a geopolitical difference. A political difference here. North Korea closing its borders and trade, it's self-imposed. They're voluntarily doing that to protect themselves. Whereas international sanctions are intended or are implemented and applied with the aim of trying to get North Korea back to the negotiating table, but also to try to dry up funding for North Korea's nuclear weapons program. And on the surface, it's technically true. A lot of these sanctions, they do target parts of North Korea's economy, things like seafood, textile, coal. But it gets very technical. But the reason why sanctions officials, American and international at the UN, the reason why they decided to impose these sanctions on those sectors of North Korea's economy was because they believed that the revenue generated back, since around 2016 when these sanctions were applied, and after 2016, the belief was that North Korea was generating billions of dollars a year, and that revenue was then put into the development of their nuclear weapons, and so that's why they're applied. But North Korea talks about it as these sanctions are hurting the welfare of the North Korean people. And that really has never been the intention of sanctions officials. But the problem, the tricky part has become such that North Korea has what it calls Pyongyang strategic line, which is parallel development between the nuclear weapons and economic development. So it's like this dual track policy. And because North Korea has that dual track aim, sanctions officials have realized that North Korea itself has blurred the line between sources of funding for its nuclear program and sources of funding for its economy.
In terms of what Kim Jong Un's next move is, there seem to be two schools of thought right now, based on what I've read. One is that, like in the past, he'll start off with a bang, a big provocation or weapons test to grab the spotlight and try to get some leverage over the new U.S. president early in the administration. The other way of looking at it is that Kim has a lot on his plate right now already with these domestic economic issues, sanctions, rebuilding from the typhoons, COVID-19. And time is on his side, given the Biden camp still has to conduct its big policy review of North Korea, which probably will take a few months. So why stir the hornet's nest now? Where do you come down on this in terms of what Kim might do next?
I think both are possibilities, but I think we need to leave both scenarios open as possibilities, but I would lean a bit more towards, if we had to bet, that he might wait it out a little bit longer because he is so preoccupied with the pandemic and his economy and all that, that the first weapons test may not come as soon as we would typically expect it to come. Now, one indicator or something that's coming up is the March exercises between the US and South Korea. And so we'll have to keep an eye on how North Korea reacts to that. Now, North Korea, we've come to a situation where there have been many observers and people who think or who say that the joint exercises cause North Korea to test weapons. But I do not think that is the right causality there. I think that North Korea tends to use these combined military drills as an excuse to test because they always have a military imperative to keep testing the weapons, because more testing means they can keep perfecting and polishing and refining the technology of their weapons. So testing as much as possible is just part of the process to reach your goal, to have an operational weapon of various classes that they have and so types that they want to have. And so they've got that, military objective and then domestic objective of, we want all these great weapons that actually work. But then there's a political timing calculation that's involved too. And so, typically they test whenever they're ready to test technologically, but then, again, the political element of it. So then sometimes, as we mentioned, it comes early on in a new U.S. administration. Sometimes it comes, we've seen them come during like America's Independence Day or some major holiday. But this time, it's hard to say with certainty, but I would suspect that they might try to get their house in order first a bit longer. But, I would hope that, and I know I've suggested this to other stakeholders and interlocutors, I would hope that, the Chinese, the Russians, Europeans, any of these countries, and South Korea, any of these countries that have connections and relationships with North Korean officials, to persuade them to wait until President Biden's team and policy is formed. And the policy review is going to take a while. His team is still being, put in place. And so it would really be a huge mistake. It would actually, North Korea would lose a lot more if it tested before Biden's team and policy is ready, because we can really, I think it's safe to assume that all doors will be shut and the Biden administration will just crank up the heat and the pressure. And that really, would not help North Korea achieve what it wants. And that just won't help anyone else. And so hopefully the Chinese in private and quietly, and the Russians are either pressuring or encouraging North Korea to hold off on any types of weapons test.
You bring up an important point, because that was another one of the shortcomings of the Trump administration's approach, I think, which was there wasn't enough multilateral cooperation of the kind we used to see with the six-party talks, right, with China, Russia, Japan, South Korea as well at the table. So do you think we'll see a return to that kind of approach with the Biden administration working with allies and partners in the region, countries that might be able to help exert leverage over North Korea?
Well, we have heard President Biden during the campaign and after he was elected say that they need to work with allies and partners, including China, on the North Korea issue. Now, we don't know what form that would take. Will it be back to a six-party style dialogue? Will it be, several different geometrical shapes within the six parties? The one important advantage of the six-party talks during the Bush administration was that it was this umbrella or this framework, the six-way dialogue framework and platform. And within that six-way broad mechanism, there were a series of bilateral conversations, trilateral, quadrilateral, so you can have a series of smaller conversations within the broader framework. And so I think for me, I like that construct, and it doesn't matter what you call it, but that, I think that helps. But what made it difficult during the six-party talks was that each time the six parties met in these formal six-party talks settings, it took forever for them to get through their opening remarks because you had all six different countries, all six different languages having to be interpreted, and then you had six different interests at stake too, and six different thoughts and approaches. And so really multilateral diplomacy and multilateral negotiations were really put to the test. But, there's really I don't think there's a silver bullet here. I mean, during the Clinton administration, it was primarily a bilateral process formally with the agreed framework in 94. But the Clinton administration was still very good about engaging and consulting with allies and partners in that process, even though technically and formally it was a bilateral format.
I've heard some people knock the six-party talks as sort of this format where the only progress ever happened when the American and North Korean representatives would go off for a private chat, have a cup of coffee on the sidelines or something like that. But
yeah, and that is really important. I've actually been to the six-party talks a couple of times to cover it in my first life, and as a journalist, and it's really interesting. The room itself, you have like these. In the walls, you've got these doors. So there are doors in the walls, or they have like side rooms in the main plenary room. And so you can have these like side conversations. And the advantage of whether it's a six-part way format or any format of dialogue, it's what you mentioned, that the chat, the private conversation over coffee or taking a walk outside, or I'm sure the Chinese had, they're bugging every plant out there so they can hear every conversation. But still, you can have these chats, and that's where a lot of like the real negotiations happen outside the formality of all the scripted presentations and speeches that you hear in the main plenary session. But see, now tying this back to the pandemic, I talked earlier about, the North Koreans setting a high bar or high price tag for talks. I suspect actually the most immediate challenge to direct negotiations will actually be the pandemic. Because again, North Korea, I suspect, thinks that the virus is the biggest threat to their survival more than American hostility. And so I would suspect that they would not want to risk any of their negotiators and be exposed to Americans when, even me sitting here in Seoul, it's scary watching the news and the numbers of American COVID numbers in the States. And so think of how North Koreans will be thinking of seeing all that news too and interpreting that. And so there are some very smart people who argue, well, there are ways to do this. You can still have a direct conversation. Brexit negotiations still happened even during COVID. But a caveat to that thinking is, well, it's hard to imagine North Korea would do whether these virtual, Zoom negotiations or, to try to get creative. I think they might be very concerned about contracting the virus. There have been anecdotes that even their diplomats overseas are not allowed to go back to the motherland physically because they're worried about infections.
You alluded earlier to the fact that there's this precedent that's been set by the Trump administration of this top-down approach to negotiations with North Korea now, this symmetry with Kim Jong Un directly. I wonder if you see that purely as a handicap for the Biden administration, given that the old approach might not work so well now, or if there might be some room to build on that model that Trump set, that precedent, given that might be a form of leverage that Biden could use.
I don't think that the summits themselves were the cause of the problem, the mess that we're in now with more advanced North Korean nuclear weapons. I think the problem with the summitry was that there was no preparation or no real strategy to support the summits to lead to actual results. It was just a photo op and theatrics for Trump, for his personal gain. And so that's the problem. So the format of summit, I personally do not have a problem with summits, but I do think that North Korea still needs to work for them. And I think, then President-elect Biden, when he said that he's willing to meet with Kim Jong Un only if he agrees to draw down his nuclear weapons in a credible way, I think that's, if we take his words literally or technically, then I think that's a good sign that leaves some room. But again, it's not going to be a freebie. And so when I say I don't have a problem with summitry, I think it's because it's precisely because of the way North Korea operates. If you want to understand how North Korea thinks, if you want to get anything done in North Korea, implement an agreement, you need to talk to the Kim leader directly. I mean, that's just the way they're constructed. And we've seen during, in the lead up to the Singapore summit and the Hanoi summit, that unlike his father's time, Kim Jong Un's negotiators are not empowered to negotiate. They're given very little room. They're basically given no room to negotiate on the nuclear issue. They can talk about all the other issues like new relationships and other types of concessions, but they're not allowed to even talk about the nuclear issue. And that's the key issue for the United States. And so this is where you have to have a conversation with Kim Jong Un. And who would be Kim Jong Un's counterpart? That would have to be another head of state. And so this is going to be a challenge. His father's negotiators, they were able to negotiate, and they were given lots of various scenarios of guidance, or there was still a process of they take it back to Capitol and get guidance and come back to and negotiate. There was a back and forth, but under Kim Jong Un, that's not the case.
I've heard Bill Perry, the former Secretary of Defense during the Clinton administration, say that whenever he was in Pyongyang negotiating with his North Korean counterpart, it was always, the end of the day, the North Korean official would go back, talk to Kim Jong-il, come back the next day. So it was almost like you were negotiating directly with the leader, but it was indirect because there was this go-between, yeah. There was
a go-between, yes. And so his grandfather and his father, yes, you had more of a so-called normal negotiating process. And that actually happens in democracies too. You have the chief envoy go back to Capitol, get instructions, and come back. I mean, but interestingly, under Kim Jong-un leadership, we don't see that type of interaction or discussion between his negotiator and himself.
Duyeon, thanks so much. This was a really wide-ranging and insightful conversation. Really appreciate you making the time, and glad we could work it out with the time difference in Seoul.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure.
Duyeon Kim is an adjunct senior fellow with the Asia Pacific Security Program at the Center for a New American Security. She joined us from Seoul. If you'd like to comment on the discussion, ask a question, or even suggest a topic for a future episode, drop us a line at podcast@worldpoliticsreview.com. This episode of Trendlines was produced by me, Elliot Waldman, and edited by Peter Dury. You can follow the team on Twitter if you'd like. WPR's handle is @WPReview. I'm @Elliot Waldman, that's with 2 L's and 1 T. And Peter is @PeterDoerrie. Thanks for listening, and tune in again next week.